Born free. Two little words that hold the hopes, the dreams, the fears, the aspirations of not only a new democracy, but also a whole new generation. Our firstborn frees, born in 1994, turn 19 this year. And by 2030, they should be active citizens in our society, and we hope part of the workforce. But today I want to ask quite a difficult question. I want to ask, are our born frees born to free fall? South Africa is a very, very young country in terms of the demographics. We have an extreme youth bulge. A youth bulge in any country is 40% of the country is within a millennial or Generation Y segment, so 18 to 30. In South Africa, we've got 60% of that demographic, which means we are a really, really young and extreme youth bulge. On top of that, 15% of that generation are adolescents, so between 15 to 24. So we've got a really, really, really young generation coming through. And a youth bulge is really useful for a country if there are two things in place. One is an excellent education system, and the second are plentiful jobs, and we have neither. So I want to look at the adolescents, because it's a large part of our future generations that are going to come through to 2030. And they're growing up and making headlines for all the wrong reasons. We have a 14-year-old who massacres his family, literally. Mother, grandmother, and sibling. Anine Boyson, who is the quintessential millennial, at 17 years old, is raped and murdered. But not only murdered, she's disemboweled. What makes our country so violent? We have one of the highest homicide rates in the world, and around about 50 murders a day, which means 50 families are traumatized each and every day. And trauma is what I want to explore, of the impact of that trauma on our young people and what kind of adults they will make in 2030. So let's just have a look at it. We have the highest rape statistics in the world. A young girl has a 1 in 3 chance of finishing secondary school in South Africa. That's quite a challenge. That same girl has a 1 in 2 chance of being raped. If we go further and we look at the scourge of HIV and AIDS, it has left a very, very deep scar. 3 million AIDS orphans and counting. And because of that, and because of the culture of Ubuntu in South Africa, we've started getting this weird phenomenon of 8% of young kids in this country who live in skip generation households, which means they are brought up by either their grandparents, grand uncles, grand aunts, essentially another generation that is not supposed to be their parents. That in itself gives a very, very different socio skew. But those are the lucky ones. They at least have somebody to look after them. What we have here are 1/5 of South African youth in child-headed households, which means at a very, very young age, they are being exposed to anxiety, to stress. They are meant to be mothers, fathers, the nurturers, teachers, siblings, breadwinners. And this super child is not meant to be in our society. They are meant to be nurtured as much as any other child you get. And then the big elephant in the room, or should I say the bull elephant in the room, are absent fathers. 60% of young black South African children grow up without fathers. They say it is one of the most ignored forms of deprivation. And statistically, if you look at all of the cases around the world, it's not only South Africa, you find that absent father households breeds more teenage pregnancies, teenage crime, and more dysfunctionality within that household or within those children. So what we're seeing now is that all our social problems, which we see as little different pillars, are actually coping mechanisms of some sort of trauma. People are using drugs, crime, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, gangsterism, and sex as some kind of escape to try and cope with that. And what's problematic in South Africa is that it's a cycle. It's a perpetuating cycle. So I'll give you one example. In 2009, they did a survey of how many young schoolgirls got pregnant. We had over 45,000 schoolgirls that got pregnant in 2009. They redid the count in 2011, and that figure jumped from 45,000 to 95,000. It means that yet another generation or another wave of children or young girls who are not prepared financially or emotionally to be mothers are passing on some other sort of trauma to their child. Because if a mother's not there, the primary source of trauma for a child is if that parent is not there, or if there's a perceived perception of abandonment. So we're kind of getting into the cycle, and we're seeing how all of these coping mechanisms carry on. So let's go back to those two pillars. Education. What I've been tracking for the past 2 years are the number of children who register for grade 1 but don't finish grade 12 or matric. In 2011, it was just over 500,000. We lost 500,000 kids in the system. Somewhere, we don't know where they are, and they didn't finish school. In 2012, that number didn't decrease, but it jumped to over 600,000. So in 2 years, in 2 graduating years, we've lost 1 million kids in a schooling system, and we don't know where they are, and they haven't come out yet. So my question really is what happens to the kids 2010, 2009, and what is going to happen in 2013 and 2014? Because in 6 years, we could potentially, and probably have, lost 3 million children who haven't finished matric. And of course, that leads to unemployment. We've got a really bad youth unemployment rate. It's nudging on 50%, and the country can't win if that happens. And about 86% of that demographic did not finish school. So you're starting to see that pattern really play out. And that is why I'm asking, what will our adults be like in 2030? So how did we get here? For me, after looking at all of the research, the core of the problem is a broken family unit or broken family syndrome. It is part historic from our history. We've had migrant workforce patterns, we've had political displacement, but we also live in a deeply patriarchal society, and we also have almost very outdated traditional customs that are blocking the progress. And I think what's really important is, if you think of trauma, we always think of it as a physical trauma. We don't think of it as an emotional trauma. But like I said before, for young children, perceived abandonment, if your parent is not there, it starts scarring you, and you start getting a very different way of looking at life and the way of your interpersonal relationships. So what I looked at was what happens when you start interrupting crucial stages of development of a child. So we know that before 5 years old, language is utmost important. If you want to teach your child a new language, before 5 is when you try and do it. Then you start learning a bit of maths in about 8. But what interested me, and that's why I looked at adolescence, is when you go from about 12 to 14, from puberty into adolescence, you start adult thinking. And it's the first time in your life where you look for an identity outside of your family circle. It's the reason why we remember our high school friends, but not really our primary school friends. You start forming your own identity. And it's very crucial, because identity and morality is what starts getting embedded into your brain in those adolescent years, as well as logic and reason. And if you start interrupting those, it becomes very skewed. So how does it play out? On a social level, you get these interpersonal problems. You might get somebody that's a bit clingy, because if you think about it, in trauma, people wonder why you always go back into an abusive relationship. But if you speak to psychologists, when you try and heal the trauma, you try and relive that trauma just to try and make sense of it. So it becomes this cycle. So what worries me is that if we have an absence of fathers, young boys don't know how to grow up and what it takes to be a man. So they take on a hyper-masculine role. And the worst case scenario, that translates into sexual abuse. For young girls, conversely, they might think that the act of sex is not an act of love, but an act of transaction. And I don't mean a financial transaction. I mean, if I do this, I won't get hurt. Or if I do that, I will be able to get X, Y, and Z out of this. It starts really, really warping how we live our lives. So I want to tell you where it's going to hit us the hardest, and the hardest is in our wallets. So for the country, the more social problems that we have, we don't get foreign investment. We've had a taste of it with Marikana, and we've just seen how foreign investors don't really want to come and touch stuff if there's too much social upliftment or upheavals. For companies, and if you're in a company, you're not going to have that consumer that's going to buy all those bling and shiny things from you. And for us, as taxpayers, it's going to hit our wallets. Because already in South Africa, we have a very, very narrow tax base. 5% of the population supports the rest. And as you can see, we're becoming a welfare state. We have a dependency ratio of 1 taxpayer to 3 dependents. It's not sustainable. We really, really have to think about this. But we can fix the problem. We need intervention, and we need much, much, much earlier intervention. We've looked around and seen what we need to do. So if you are a company and you have a CSI program, it's all very well to go and paint a school or to give computers and laptops to a school. But if you don't give the IT support, or if that school doesn't even have desks to put the computers on, it's not going to break those cycles. So what we can do is intervene a lot earlier. And these are some examples that I want to share with you, and this is how we can fix this problem. Mothers and women. We need to support the mothers. Women are the glue that holds South Africa together. I've said we are a patriarchal society, but globally, we're moving into a female century. So we're at odds with what's happening in terms of trends around the world. So we need to nurture the mothers. We need to support mothers, and we need to support women. Because even though, in terms of formal employment, we don't have that many women in the formal workforce, in terms of the informal sector, women support more people per capita than men in this country. So support the woman. We need to go into preschool. Human rights is an intervention where they give young preschoolers different coloring books. It starts and kickstarts that cognitive ability, and it makes learning a lot more fun and people wanting to do fun. Sometimes the interventions are in the strangest places, and this is my point. We think we're going to help, and we do things, and we give parcels, but we're papering over the cracks. Professor Jonathan Jansen, who I think should be our education minister, has started something called, thank you, No Student Hungry, because he found out that you've got these brilliant students, but they're failing. And it's not because they're stupid, it's not because they can't comprehend, it's because they're so damn hungry, they can't think straight. So you start feeding them, and it's a mentorship program, and once you go into that, it passes on from student to student to student, so it carries on. And this one, the last one, I think is fantastic. It's called Partners for Possibility. Louise van Rijn, standing there, what she does is she puts a CEO in touch with the headmaster, and the CEOs help run the schools like businesses so that we can get the schooling system. And exactly what Molly was saying, we need those teachers. So there's different pillars that we need to support. Women, teachers, communities. We are a deeply religious society, so churches help all of those things. And of course, peer-to-peer youth reviews, because we can't see the youth as this homogenous blob that we just don't listen to. We need to listen to their voices, because this new generation is a very, very different way of thinking. It's not just a different generation gap. So we've reached a fork in the road. In 1994, we reached a political fork. 2014, it's a socio-economic fork. We were handed the most precious gift of this fantastic democracy, but we were not given a handbook of how to be active citizens. And we need to be active citizens to do that, because if 7 out of 10 born frees are not finishing school, the 3 that finish are not the problem, it's the 7 that do. And I want to show you, and just to end, what happens in other youth bulges around the world. Yesterday, we've seen what's happened in Egypt, and that, the Arab Spring, was started off by a bread seller who was just trying to feed his family and was manhandled by the police. in Turkey, in Istanbul, some eco-warriors were trying to save their little park in Istanbul from some greedy developers, and that went a bit sour. And in Brazil, it was about bus fares. We've had Marikana as a little bit of a forewarning, and I think we should heed that warning, because we don't want our precious youth bulge to pop. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.